Good evening, welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the programme tonight, the collapse of Afghanistan to the Taliban seems increasingly imminent, with fighting now being reported in many major centres including Kandahar, where India has had to evacuate its consulate staff who've now been flown back to India in an Indian Air Force aircraft. On the show tonight, a leading Afghan MP, the head of international affairs and regional cooperation in the National Security Council of Afghanistan, and a former Indian ambassador to Kabul on what the future holds. It's a fantastic panel of leading experts. The big topic tonight, Indian diplomats evacuated from Kandahar, is the collapse of Afghanistan to the Taliban now imminent. But first, let's give you an update on the developments in the last 24 hours. Fighting has intensified in many parts of Afghanistan, not least of all in the Kandahar area. This has resulted in India having to evacuate 50 of its diplomatic and non-diplomatic consular staff from its consulate in the city of Kandahar. The Taliban is reported to be making rapid gains. The government of India says the evacuation that took place today was because of intense fighting near Kandahar. These officials were evacuated in an Indian Air Force aircraft that did not fly over Pakistani airspace, using a longer route instead, and have successfully brought back those 50 Indian consular staff. The consulate in Kandahar has not been closed, is what the External Affairs Ministry says. They say because of intense fighting near Kandahar city, India-based personnel have been brought back for the time being. This is a purely temporary measure until the situation stabilizes. The safety and security of our personnel is paramount, and that the consulate continues to operate through our local staff members. India is closely monitoring the evolving security situation in Afghanistan. Arrangements are being made to ensure continued delivery of visa and consular services through our embassy in Kabul. Well, joining us now, Ahmed Shuja, the head of international affairs and regional cooperation in the National Security Council of Afghanistan. Maryam Sulaimankil is a member of Afghanistan's parliament, and Ambassador Vivek Karju, former ambassador to Kabul, joins us as well. Ms. Sulaimankil, let me come to you first. Since we spoke about a week back, the situation seems to be deteriorating fast. Are there any signs of a real fight back by the Afghan army?
The Afghan army is fighting on an unprecedented level, where the Taliban, when you look at the casualties of the Taliban versus the Afghan army, you clearly see who's winning the war. What's happening right now is that there's a Pakistani propaganda that's supporting the Taliban, where it's nurturing fear-mongering and it's an alarmist nature. And so the media is pushing this rhetoric that all these districts are falling, but no one is reporting about how the ANA is recapturing those districts. If the Taliban's numbers were correct, which they're claiming to be over 50% of the country is theirs, why are their leadership not here? Why are they in Quetta? Why are they in Peshawar? Why are they in Doha?
Yeah. In fact, I wanted to take that question to Ahmed Shuja as well. Mr. Shuja, give us the status of the big cities, Kandahar, Herat, Jalalabad, and Mazar-e-Sharif. Kabul, we know for the moment, is okay.
Well, thank you for having me, and I can completely agree with Ms. Sulaimankil's assessment over there. All of the big cities are completely safe and secure, and that is despite the fact that the Taliban are actually pursuing very brazenly a strategy of complete military takeover by terrorism. But the NDTV have been fighting bravely, not just in securing all of the major metropolitan centers, Kandahar, Mazar, Herat, Kabul, obviously, but also Jalalabad and other provincial centers. Not a single provincial center of the 34 provinces in this country has fallen to the Taliban, despite their full-on push this year, but also despite their full-on push for the past about 10 years now. Because if you recall, the actual withdrawal of American forces started in 2011 when President Obama's surge, which was announced in 2009, actually started receding. And so we've been taking over security responsibility progressively. And despite the strategy of complete military takeover through the use of terrorism, the Taliban have been completely failing to take any of the provincial centers, let alone major cities like Kandahar or Kabul.
Ambassador Karju, you've spent many years in the Foreign Service, and after you retired, looking at this entire region. When you were ambassador in Kabul, I remember visiting you, and there was an election which India had helped Afghanistan in, where our Election Commission of India had played a very important role in helping to facilitate, encourage and train for that process of democracy. And what a wonderful time that was to see democracy in Afghanistan. What are your own personal thoughts now when you see that democracy being challenged in the way it is?
No, I'm truly saddened at the Afghan situation. And I'm afraid I can't share the optimism of my two colleagues on the panel. I wish I could. It is a very difficult security situation for the Kabul elite at the moment. The Kabul political class, and that is how I see it, many of them have been my close personal friends. I was involved, as Vishnu, as you know, in looking at Afghanistan, or looking after the Afghan. As Joint Secretary, I was in charge of our relations with Afghanistan starting from 1995. So I've gone through the period of 1995 and 2001. Those were the years when I was in charge. And the recurring thought coming to me at the moment is whether the situation is slipping back to that period. Yes, it is true that at the moment the major provincial centers as well as the major cities are not with the Taliban. And yes, there is an element of propaganda, but it hardly can be denied that the Taliban have made military strides. If India has had to evacuate its personnel from Kandahar, it is not because of anything else, but because of an apprehension that there is fighting, and fighting too close to Kandahar, and security of personnel is paramount.
Yeah.
So, given that situation, I think it will be wrong to think that the military situation is easy. The ANSF is fighting back, but that's not the main point. The main point to my mind is the cohesion in Kabul, for the political cohesion in Kabul. And even if I offend my two colleagues, as an old friend of Afghanistan of 25 years standing, and I have personal relations with many Afghan leaders, I regret to say I don't see the cohesion that is needed. I haven't seen it for a long time.
Okay.
And I'm afraid, my last point, that history teaches us that if political cohesion is not maintained, then the army will break.
Ms. Sulaiman, would you like to respond to that? Very strong words from Ambassador Kajol.
I'm not happy making this comment, but that is what experience
Okay, all right, Ambassador. Let Ms. Sulaiman respond to that. Political cohesion in Kabul as a first step, and perhaps the most important step in ensuring the integrity of your country.
I think it's very important. I agree with the ambassador with what he's saying, but we have to look at what the foundational issues is. And Mr. Ambassador, you must know this more than anyone else does, is that in the history of the world, there's never been a terrorist organization that can, or any type of militia, any type of warmongering group that can exist for over 2 decades, 3 decades, without a neighboring country's support. In this foundational issue is Pakistan, and how Pakistan is feeding into some of the old Mujahideen leaders, how they are feeding on some of these political positions, paying them off, giving them special treatment to rile them up against the government, no matter what it is. But the government is strong. Right now, if you look at Herat, we have Ismail Khan fighting the Taliban himself. If you look at the north, we have people in the east, in the west, and even in Kandahar. The main point of the Kandahar attack was to get into the prison, to release some of the most powerful Taliban prisoners that were there, and we had moved them out of there. I really, truly believe with international support, and especially India's support in the region, and in our Air Force specifically, I think we are much stronger than the Taliban, and very soon you'll see their demise.
We certainly hope that that is the case. Amit Shuja, do you feel, not just as an analyst and you know, somebody in your role in the National Security Council, but as an Afghan, do you feel betrayed by America's decision to leave in this manner?
Look, Afghanistan never asked any country to stay in our country beyond what their politics and their economic situation allow. And so you will see that President Ghani, the entire Afghan government, the entire political elite actually supported the decision by President Biden to withdraw from Afghanistan, but also supported NATO's decision, which endorsed the President Biden's decision. But I think I completely agree with the ambassador. As an old friend, I think your words of wisdom, your experience, the depth and breadth of engagement that you bring with multiple actors in our country is valuable. Which is why when you talk and other people in the Indian Foreign Service and retired officials with whom I keep regular contact talk, we listen. But the truth is that the difference between the 1990s and the 2020s is the fact that in the 1990s, the Taliban were actually a different movement, and the Afghan government did not exist at that moment. Today, all of the people who are rising up in the resistance against the Taliban are not doing it as part of a disorganized, disgruntled, broken apart, fractious local militias. They're all doing it in coordination with and under the support of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. And so when you talk about political cohesion, you're seeing political cohesion not just in the center in Kabul, but also in the provinces. Everybody who is raising up and standing against the Taliban is doing it in support of and in coordination with the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. And look, tell me one country in which all of the politicians, one democratic country in which all the politicians who are in power, in the opposition, speak with one mind. No such country exists. Of course, Afghanistan is a democratic country. Of course, we have a vibrant media, and there are differences of opinion. But I think on the fundamental issues of the preservation of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, of the opposition to the Taliban, you will find not a single divergence of opinion on those issues. And I think you would be a good judge of that when I say this. So that's important for us to keep in context. But look at what happens when the Taliban, a movement which is supposedly cohesive but also autocratic, look at what happens when you expose them to the media. There was a leaked report from a few weeks ago, actually, in which the central tippy-top leadership of the Taliban was actually beseeching its leadership, begging them, for heaven's sake, stop taking second, third, and fourth wives on the Taliban public dime.
Yep.
The Taliban appear cohesive, not because they are actually a monolith, but because they're opaque. They're not open to the public.
Right.
The Afghan government is not like that. We have a vibrant press, and there are bound to be differences of opinion.
Before I come back to Ambassador Kachhu, Ms. Sulaiman, the talks with the Taliban, in a sense, as unfortunate as they are, is a reality. But these talks have stalled, haven't they? There is no progress. Is that a worry?
Yeah, it's a huge worry, but it's also showing the true colors of what's really going on. The American troops are gone, their prisoners have been released, and still they're fighting and killing innocent Afghan people. On top of that, their main goal is the destruction of infrastructure in Afghanistan. The one point that bothers me the most in the media is when they talk about fallen districts. We have to differentiate between an overrun district and a fallen district. What's the difference? They come in, they take a few buildings, they overrun it for a little bit, they strike a lot of fear and terror into people's hearts and eyes and souls, but the Afghan army every single time is able to take back that district. So it's terrifying, and now we can see, before every meeting, every peace meeting, where do they run to? They run to Pakistan and they get their advice. Then they show up at the meeting. They run to Russia. They speak with the Chinese. It's never one-on-one Afghan bilateral communication in Afghanistan.
Right.
If it's true that they have overrun all these districts and they're willing to talk about peace, why are they not in Afghanistan? Why are their families not in Afghanistan? Why are they in luxury homes and mansions in Doha, in Qatar, in Peshawar, in Rawalpindi? That's where my main focus is that we need to look at what the foundational issue is. And this affects not only Afghans, but it affects the Indian population as well. When terrorism wins in Afghanistan, terrorism wins internationally.
Ambassador Kachhu, you've got two of the most passionate young Afghans on this program.
Thank you.
And it's just so wonderful to see the spirit with which you're sort of taking on this huge challenge. Your thoughts, Ambassador?
No, I'm very heartened by the spirit that my young Afghan friends are showing. Quite clearly, they represent the Afghan youth, many of whom have come to age in this century.
Yeah.
And clearly they are not shackled by the prejudices and the difficulties and the ideologies of the past. They are looking forward. And that's very welcome. But at the same time, I must be realistic. I do see that in the Taliban, and there is a kind of a hold which they are bringing to bear on elements of the rural population, especially in the Pashtun heartland. And I again regret to say, and it gives me no happiness to say, but I regret to say that the Pashtun leadership in Kabul let the Taliban have space in the Pashtun heartland and did not combat them, did not combat their ideology sufficiently enough. So today, while we have friends, and I'm heartened, as I said, by friends who are representing the youth of the modern youth of Afghanistan, yet there are groups within Afghanistan who don't subscribe to the views which are represented here. And they are substantial in number. And they are the quarry of the Taliban. Second, I entirely agree about the Pakistan Taliban nexus. But let's be realistic. The Taliban have survived, and 20 years of American presence has not been able to wipe them out.
Right.
So there is something there. And my Afghan friends will have to acknowledge that. You can't live in denial. There is something there. They follow an ideology which is violent, which I frankly cannot stomach. I dislike it, but I see it. And my last point, Vishnu, which is most important. Whereas in the 1990s, they did not have international legitimacy. That is why the government of Professor Burhanuddin Rabbani still had the UN seat then. Today, on the other hand, I find that the Americans did a deal with them, that the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians welcomed them. And therefore, whether we like it or not, there is an international legitimacy to this group. Whether it should be or should not be is a different issue. But let's look at the situation realistically. And I will urge my young Afghan friends also to look at it, and they have their job cut out. Because they too have to, my last point to them, they have to wean away those who are attracted to Taliban ideologies within Afghanistan, and regrettably, it's no longer restricted to the Pashtun heartland.
Okay, Ambassador, I just want to, I want to go across to my panelists. Ahmed Shuja, would you like to respond to that? Perhaps the key point being that the ideological strength of the Taliban unfortunately pervades in the Pashtun heartland and in other parts, and that represents, more than the military might, perhaps the biggest threat.
Well, I completely respect the ambassador's views on that, but let me also point out that what the Taliban represent is actually militant religious extremism. And militant religious extremism exists among not just the Afghans, but populations across the world, not just Islamist militant extremists, but militant extremists everywhere. And so the problem isn't that this exists. Well, the problem isn't that this is only unique to a particular segment of Afghan society. The problem is that if we let this actually pervade and grow as a cancer, not just the militant extremist ideologues among the Taliban are going to win in Afghanistan, they are going to provide a proof of concept for militant extremist ideologues everywhere around the world. And that is the kind of fight that we're engaged in, and this is the kind of fight that I have engaged in my entire life. The ambassador was an ambassador in the 1990s, or maybe was joint secretary, but I actually grew up in the shadow of the Taliban. We grew up in families that actually tried to resist the Taliban, that tried to fight the Taliban, or that became vagrants and destitutes. And so we are not speaking from a place of luxury. we're not speaking from a place of detachment. We're speaking from a deeply felt personal experience to the extent that you see passion in our voices. And so that is important. And I think the other thing is, and the ambassador rightly pointed the fact that the Taliban seem to be enjoying a degree of mainstreaming internationally at this moment, which is something that we need to address, and we need to address this immediately and quickly. But let me also point out, in addition to that, Vishnu, the point is that none of the countries that the ambassador named, China, Russia, the US, Iran, none of them supports the return of an emirate. All of them support the staying of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and virtually no country, literally no country, supports the return of the emirate through a campaign of violent terrorism.
Yeah, yeah.
So that is a big difference. Sure, they're hosting some Taliban, and we should put an end to that.
Yeah.
But I think that the real deep question, which is beyond the Facebook post and Twitter propaganda by Taliban trolls, is quite different.
Ms. Sulaim Uncle, my last question to you, and it's something which I asked you last time as well. I think it needs to be repeated. The victory of democracy in India is also to a large extent the victory of women like yourself. 20 years ago, on the front line between Kabul and Charikar, and when one went over there, one could hardly ever see a woman, and women were protected. Their lives, their rights didn't exist almost. And then you've got someone as dynamic as you. You've got women parliamentarians like you. You've got so many women teachers and women doctors, and it's such a wonderful victory of rights, of human rights. How is that one of the biggest victories in Afghanistan in 20 years, the rights of women?
It's thanks to our constitution. Our constitution was made by the people, and the people are 51% of them are women. And going back to what we were saying earlier, we aren't the same Afghans of the 90s. The young people of today were the young people who were born and raised on this soil, and they have a different sense of patriotism. They were not raised in a camp in Pakistan or abroad somewhere else. So it's a new breed of Afghan youth here that are not willing to go back, that are willing to, not just women, but young people, businessmen, politicians, all in general, they're not willing to go back to the 90s. One of my most important points that I wanted to say regarding the last question you said, and I'll come back to this women's rights issue, was that I represent the Kuchis.
Yes.
The Kuchis are the people who are the #1 recruited in the Taliban, and they're also being used as shields by the Taliban and getting killed on a daily basis. The Pashtun identity, our culture, our who we are, is trying to be eradicated and erased and to become an Islamist identity. This is where our friends in India need to support this specific group of people, this diaspora of the Kuchi and the nomads. They have the least access to education. They have the least access to healthcare. Just like the Pashtuns in Pakhtunkhwa, who also get recruited into terrorist organizations all the time. I do not like saying, even connecting the idea that Kuchi or Pashtun means Taliban. There are other ethnic groups that are Taliban. It's not an Afghan ideology. Afghanistan is 5,000 years old, and until we have the last breath in our lungs, the last Afghan will fight against the Taliban, will fight against anyone trying to take our territory and being sold to Pakistan. That's one thing. When it comes to being a woman, the strongest women I've ever met in my life are from Afghanistan. These women are raising sons and children that will be fighting for not just Afghanistan, for the whole region, for the entire world. And we cannot abandon these women in the future. So we need India's strong voice to lobby for us in the UN. There is no such thing as a good Taliban or a bad Taliban. They both should be on a terrorist list. It was wrong from the beginning that TTP was a terrorist, but then the Afghan Taliban are not a terrorist. So we need India's strong voice to stand up and support Afghan women, Afghan people, human rights in the region, because it affects all of us. Again, Vishnu, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for having me again.
I'd like to thank all of you very much for joining us. Afghanistan and India, that relationship will always remain strong. It always has been strong through the most difficult times, and I hope it stays that way. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. Thank you very much indeed. Well, we're out of time.